Hi everyone, and welcome back to OMN Insights. My name is Soreti Kadia, and I'm your host. Today we are going to be having a conversation about overall advocacy efforts on the conditions of war and in the pursuits for peace in Oromia. To have this conversation, we are joined by a member of the Oromo Leadership and Legacy Association's advocacy team, Dr. Nados Assel. Thank you so much for being with us today, Dr. Nados.
Thank you for having me, Soreti. It's a real honor to be here.
Pleasure, pleasure. So the Oromo Leadership and Legacy Association has been engaging in advocacy to try and change, improve, and raise awareness about the political and human rights conditions in Oromia for years now. There is, though, what seems to be a collectively held opinion across the Oromo communities, both in the diaspora and in the country, that the Oromo question and plight are not being significantly addressed by the international community. Dr. Nados, from your experience in this advocacy work with the Oromo Leadership and Legacy Association, what is your assessment of this view, and what do you think would need to be done differently for there to be more visibility of the Oromo struggle at an international level?
Yes, I don't disagree with that assessment. The international community has been largely focused on Tigray's conflict and has largely ignored what's happening in Oromia, even though the conflict in Oromia predates the war in Tigray. And OLA and other organizations have raised this concern that there isn't enough attention being given to Oromia. And I can think of a couple of reasons why the international community has been slow in reacting to what's happening in Oromia. One, I don't believe the international community fully grasps the central place that Oromia plays in the peace in Ethiopia and in the Horn of Africa. Oromia is a very large state, and it's a home for millions of people. Its geography makes it so central to whatever is happening in Ethiopia. And so the international community has not fully grasped that if there is no peace in Oromia, there is no peace in Ethiopia. So that is really impossible. And this fact has not really dawned on the international community. And I believe that's one of the reasons why they've been really slow to react to what's happening. And the other reason I can think of is that the current main party, the ruling party in Ethiopia, has constituencies who are Oromos, which makes it a really real challenge for the international community. And so the current ruling party in Ethiopia, the main party, is engaging with the international community and says it represents Oromos. So this paints a very complicated picture. And so I think it confuses the international community and makes the reaction very slow. And when I come to the second question, what can be done to improve the current state of things? And I believe this falls on everybody. Each individual person is responsible. As people living in diaspora, we have certain things that are available to us that's not available to Oromos in Ethiopia. And everybody can engage in advocacy efforts. So there are platforms, social media platforms, and especially platforms such as Twitter that actually make it possible to reach these different organizations and voice our concerns. So everybody should take advocacy seriously. It falls on everybody. And especially since there is conflicting narrative that come from the country in terms of the ruling party, the main ruling party saying that it represents Oromo interest, we have to do even more advocacy to make sure that the sufferings of Oromos in the country to be heard. And the other thing I can think of is to improve the situation is by supporting organizations that are engaged in advocacy. Everything requires resources, whether it's financial or human resource. So all of us have the responsibility to advocate, to support these organizations. And the third point that I want to make is that there needs to be a shift in thinking, because some people may not think advocacy is important in Oromo struggle. However, if we don't advocate for people who are suffering, if we don't tell their stories, if we don't tell the stories of the Abagadas who were murdered, if we don't tell the story of Emmanuel Wundumu, who was assassinated in broad daylight while people are watching, if we don't tell the stories, if we don't advocate, the world is not going to know these stories. So I think there has to be a shift in thinking about the role of advocacy to make sure that people outside Oromia, people who are in the international community are aware of the atrocities that are ongoing in Oromia. And most of the time, these stories are not reported on the main media. And it falls on Oromo medias to report this. So if advocacy is not there, then it's as if these things don't happen, has never happened. So I really feel strongly about this, that people, there needs to be a shift in how people think about advocacy. However, even saying this, I think in the past few years, things have improved in the awareness of the international community about the sufferings of Oromos. And this is due to advocacy. The narrative that Ethiopia is a country that is represented by one culture, one language, one religion, one ethnic group is no longer the case. I believe there has been awareness that Ethiopia is a very complex country. It's made up of a nation and nationalities, and there's different languages, different religions, and different ethnic groups coexisting in Ethiopia. So I think that picture has slowly changed, and it's slow, but it's changing. So I believe that advocacy is not without merit, and it has yielded some fruits. And an example that I would like to cite is in 2022, about 20 Oromo communities met with US aid and State Department and discussed issues that are affecting Oromos. And we had the opportunity to submit our questions ahead of time, and they came prepared to address some of our concerns. And this happened about 2 times in 2022, which was something I would like to highlight, because they came to discuss, the State Department and the US aid came to discuss issues that are affecting Oromos. And so to me, that signals a shift in the awareness that Oromos have issues, they have grievances in Ethiopia, and they've been affected, they're being killed, they're suffering, and that the world is slowly realizing that, including the US. So I think even though more needs to be done, I believe there have been improvements the past few years.
Really comprehensive answer, Dr. Nardos. I found it really telling and interesting that you highlighted this dynamic whereby the international community is struggling to understand the how and why behind the continued plight, human rights plight in Oromia, given that this is a government where Oromos have significant representation, because this was the narrative we were really facing at the beginning of Abiy Ahmed's tenure, whereby there was a question of, well, the Oromo cause really, or the Oromo question, or the Oromo plight, should shift significantly because there's now an Oromo prime minister in power. And I think I was under the impression that we had kind of gotten past that point, and people were understanding that that's that's not really the answer that people were looking for, just a single person in leadership or a few people in leadership. But it's really interesting for you to hear from you that this is still the narrative that you're coming up against in your work and that you're hearing, that there's difficulty in understanding this dynamic. Also, really, thank you for that example that you shared with us in terms of the advocacy work that you've seen happen over the last year in the context of this meeting with USAID. And I also want to highlight your point about stories, because I think this is really necessary and really powerful. Overall, thank you for that answer. Coming to our next question. Recently, Ola, and I'm going to take a moment here I should have done this at the beginning, to differentiate between OLA and Ola, the Oromo Leadership and Legacy Association. In this conversation, when we say Ola, we are talking about the Oromo Leadership and Legacy Association. If we are going to be mentioning the Oromo Liberation Army, we will either say the OLA or we will say the Oromo Liberation Army. This is context for our viewers for the rest of our conversation. So yes, recently, Ola published a policy paper addressing the international community's approach to the crisis in Ethiopia. It's 32 pages long, and it can be found on your website for our viewers who would like to read its full contents. But I'll just read a small part of it here. It says, specifically, the Oromo Legacy, Leadership and Advocacy Association, OLA, urges diplomats to first perform a cross-country analysis of human rights violations to gain a better understanding of the current Ethiopian landscape. OLA urges the international community to utilize the diplomatic tools at their disposal to encourage the Ethiopian government to protect human rights, prioritize the flow of humanitarian assistance to all who need it across the country, and lay the groundwork for lasting peace through a truly inclusive transitional justice process. Dr. Nardos, what does OLA emphasize when articulating the root causes of the overall political crisis in Ethiopia to international stakeholders? And as a follow-up question, because you kind of mentioned this in your first answer in saying that the international community has not really grasped the extent of how impactful what happens in Oromia is to the rest of the country and even the region. So what is it that should be really understood by this international community about the regional impacts of the deteriorating political situation in Oromia?
Okay, thank you for that question, Sariti. When OLA engages with the international community, it tries to emphasize that the problem in Ethiopia is a foundational one. It's a structural one. And that's why it can only be addressed through a political dialogue and political settlement. As we all know, and maybe this was not as apparent to the international community, however, as we all know that Ethiopia was a country that was formed by force. Oromos did not choose to be part of Ethiopia, but they are now. So the way the country was formed, the country was put together, and it's not just Oromos, but other southern nations were annexed into Ethiopia. So it's not a country that is formed by consensus. There are contradictions that exist in the country, and Oromos have been raising their questions for decades and decades. So all the previous governments have tried to shut down this question, have not addressed this question, and maybe that they hope that this question just will go away. When Prime Minister Abiy came into the picture and into power, there was a lot of hope and optimism. However, that hope was squandered, and questions remained unanswered. And actually, the government used the same tactics as the previous governments to shut down Oromos, to imprison Oromos. And over the last 4 years, there has been tremendous amount of human rights abuse that happened because of this. So many Oromos are in prison. Opposition political party members are in prison. Oromos were killed, tortured, displaced, and so on. So because this question was not addressed, it has led us to where we are right now, currently. And if it's not addressed today, if this is not seriously discussed, this is going to just prolong the suffering of the country. So if there is no political dialogue, then this will continue. It's not going to go away. The Oromo question is not going to go away. It's going to be there. If it's not addressed today, it's just going to keep festering below the surface. So I believe the way the Oromo question has been tried to shut down and not be addressed is one of the main reasons why we are in this political crisis, and the fact that the current ruling government also squandered the hope and the optimism that people had at the beginning of its governance. And when I come to the second question, yeah, the regional impact. So as I alluded to it before, if there is no peace in Oromia, there's not going to be peace in Ethiopia. And Oromia is also, when you think about the regional impact, it's bordering other countries. So it's really critical that what happens in Oromia will also affect neighboring countries. And I don't believe the international community has fully grasped that what happens in Oromia could spill over to the neighboring countries. For instance, if there is massive displacement, there could be a refugee crisis that could impact the region and outside the region as well, as far as Europe, because that's what happens. So the regional impact of things happening in Oromia is really far-reaching.
Thank you for that, Dr. Nardos. It's really inspiring and promising to hear that the work you're doing is pushing the narrative that says that Ethiopia's issues are structural and are historic and can't be solved without facing a complicated and tense historical context. On the 9th of February, Ola and a collective of diaspora Oromo associations and organizations issued a statement titled "Response to Our Call for a Peaceful Resolution to Conflict in Oromia." And in it, Ola noted that in light of Kebede Disisa's, this is the Ethiopian federal government's communications minister, in light of his comments essentially rejecting the call for a third-party mediator to any potential peace talks between the OLA and the government. This is a condition that the OLA noted in its political manifesto. Your statement noted, and I quote directly from the statement here, "We are therefore concerned that the Ethiopian government is either not serious about pursuing peace or is seeking opportunities to appear open to peace talks when remarks may be heard by the international community, when in actuality the government has no interest in finding a lasting peaceful solution to the conflict in Oromia." Ola will continue to call for the Ethiopian government and the OLA to find a peaceful, negotiated end to the conflict that has ravaged Oromia over the last 4 years. Furthermore, on the 13th of March, Ola also issued a press release with World Beyond War, addressing the US Secretary of State's upcoming visit to Ethiopia, and again, the overall conditions of conflict in Oromia. And in the statement, Ola has named all actors that are participating in the current war in Oromia as being accused of various human rights abuses. As critical as I think everybody would consider a ceasefire in Oromia to be, I think that there is a fear that these prospective peace talks, particularly in the way that the government is pursuing to approach them and structure them, won't really be addressing the poor human rights conditions that are obstructing overall conditions of peace in Oromia, and that are present and that will be present if not addressed, whether or not there is an oppositional insurgency to the government. Dr. Nardos, if these peace talks were to happen today or tomorrow, what would Ola hope that these peace talks would focus on and essentially achieve?
Yeah, so if these talks were to happen, if the government is really serious about its intention to hold these peace talks, and Ola has indicated several times that they're open to negotiations. So if this was to happen, what I would hope is that there would be cessation of hostilities at the beginning. Really, Oromia is tired of war. People have suffered. People have died over the past 4 years. Students in some areas cannot go to school. Their lives have been disrupted. People have left their homes. They're in camps, in IDPs. So I think the first thing I would hope is like there's no war, that people actually have some semblance to normalcy in their lives, because they really, really need it. And Oromia needs peace right now. So I would hope that there would be a cessation of hostilities if these talks were to happen. The second thing I'm hoping for from these peace talks is release of political prisoners and also innocent Oromos that have been suffering behind bars the past few years. I hope the peace talks will make this a reality. And the third thing that I would hope for is that this peace talks are only the beginning, and they will open up the path to more inclusive political dialogue with diverse political views and visions for the country. And I hope this will be more inclusive. And it's be only the beginning. This conversation will only be the beginning, and then include others as well.
So these peace talks, in the beginning, I'm understanding from what you're saying, is that it's really about ceasing hostilities so that day-to-day life resumes for people at a grassroots level. And then after that is when we should be structuring a space for us to have a broader conversation about Ethiopia, about the things that are holding us back from being able to perhaps live together or otherwise. In this follow-up conversation, what is it that you think really needs to be on the table in terms of perhaps historical memories that should be discussed or otherwise?
I think everything should be on the table. If there is hope for building a better Ethiopia, if there's hope for living together, everything has to be discussed. And this has not happened in Ethiopian history, so this will be unprecedented, right? To discuss how to move the country forward. So in my opinion, everything has to be on the table and discussed, and a political consensus needs to be reached on how to build a country that is going to work for everybody that lives in Ethiopia.
Thank you so much, Dr. Nardos. You're right in saying that such a conversation would be unprecedented in the history of Ethiopia's existence, making it extremely, extremely critical if the country is to find a way forward in a way that works for everyone. So I really thank you for joining us for this conversation today, Dr. Nardos, and giving us insight into the work that Ola is doing on the front lines of advocacy on the conditions in Oromia.
Thank you, Sariti, for having me.
Well, thank you everybody for watching. It is such a critical time politically in Oromia, and in fact, it's been so for many years now. But it is so important, as our guest Dr. Nardos shared with us today, that everybody who has a stake in what happens in Oromia, particularly those who have livelihood there, who have family there, who are connected to the Oromo cause, the struggle and the plight, recognize that now is an extremely important time to use your voice and to make sure that we are heard as we come to what feels like the final battleground for what has been going on in Oromia really for centuries. I thank you for watching. You are watching OMN Insight. My name is Sariti Kadir. I'm your host, and I look forward to seeing you next time.